Lonely Cowboy found a young Comanche girl tied in the desert with a plaque, "White man never forgive," under a sky white as boiled bone. The Llano Estacado in 1889 ran out in every direction so flat a man could swear. He saw the curve of the earth, and a lone cowboy rode that wide emptiness. His name was Jonah Hale, and he was lean from miles and quiet from years, and his light brown horse moved with the unbothered breath of an animal that knew the taste of distance. The hour was hard noon, and the wind dragged heat through the mesquite like a rasp. He had been following a trail that was hardly a trail at all, just scuffed sand that said someone had been pulled rather than walked, and he let his mare pick through thorn and gravel until a gnarl of roots and a dead limb shaped a crooked gate, and he passed through and found the thing that changed his breathing. Because there, at the base of the mesquite, a young Comanche woman lay half-seated, half-fallen her back against the trunk, her legs drawn by the rawhide that bit her ankles and carried around the roots and up again to cinch her wrists to the lower bowl. The knots were sailor-tight and cruel, tight, and the skin under them was rubbed raw to a red shine. She was 18 by the look of her, with 2 dark braids that had hung on through dust and fear, and a simple fringe dress dulled to the color of old deer hide. A beaded necklace lay twisted under her collarbone, and flies had come to her cracked lips, and she did not bother to move them away next to her. A rough plank had been nailed low into the trunk, and on the plank big red letters shouted, "White man never forgive," and someone had driven the message deeper by stabbing a medium knife through the board. The blade left open, so the sun struck it and jumped a thin bright line across the letters. It was not only a warning, it was a dare and a promise of more. The kind of thing men leave behind. When they want their hate to keep talking after they ride away, Jonah stepped from the saddle and the leather creaked like an old hinge. He spoke the way a man speaks to a trapped colt girl. "Hear me, I will not harm you." The name came out of her in a scrape of breath, Talanatse, and he nodded as if a name were a rope he could now throw. He poured a sip of water and touched it to her mouth, and she took it with the care of someone who knows water has more weight than metal. He set his pocket knife to the laces at her ankles first, because legs try to kick life back when arms are freed too soon. The rawhide fought him like it wanted to stay part of her, but blade and patience together will beat most knots, and he cut and unwound until the swollen ring of the binding lay loose around her skin. Then he worked at the wrist laces, the fibers slick with sweat and dust, and he talked low while the blade whispered, because a voice can do a little work on fear. The last lace gave, and she sagged forward. He caught her with the easy strength that comes from throwing calves and righting saddles. Her weight was almost nothing, heat and bone and stubborn breath. He slid his own coat around her shoulders, though the day would have cooked a man in iron, for it is not always cold that makes a body shake. He pried the knife free from the plank and closed it, and felt the futility in his palm as if steel remembered what it had been used for. He yanked the nails and took the plank too, because there are things the wind should not be allowed to read again. He lifted her onto the blanket, rolled behind his saddle and climbed up behind, and set his heels, and the horse turned for the low run of ground, where Mesquite Drawline Camp lay a bunkhouse barely larger than a trail wagon, a water barrel with a lid against dust, a stove black as coal and honest as iron, and a patch of shade that could be called mercy on a ledger. The room at the line camp held the smell of soap and iron and cedar splits. Jonah laid Tala on the bunk and struck the lamp. Though sun reached through the chinks, the small flame made the corners kind. He pumped water into a basin and warmed a pot on the stove and set out a strip of clean cotton and a jar of rendered bear grease. He cleaned the blood crust and dust from the rope, burns the skin under the laces like wet parchment, and he worked slow the way you must work, when the thing before you has already survived more than you can see. Tala watched him with the half-lidded stare of someone who does not know if she has left the place of danger or only fallen into another, and he answered that stare with quiet hands and ordinary talk, because the useful spell of ordinary will sometimes close the gate on panic. "This here is Mesquite Draw," he said. "Nearest town, more rumor than buildings. I ride fence lines and sleep where beans and a roof know my name. My horse is called Lucero, on account of how he keeps the star in his eye at dusk, and you are Talanatse, and you are alive. and in this room you will stay alive." She tried to lift her bound hands and winced, and he showed her the cotton and the grease and the water, as if those were the only weapons in the territory, and for this evening, he wrapped her wrists and ankles snug, not tight, and slid a folded blanket under her heels to ease the throb. He set a tin cup to her lips again, and then a spoon of beans, and she took both in small measures, while never quite letting him leave the corner of her gaze when she slept. It was in short pieces like a deer drinking at a river, and each time she jerked awake, her eyes darted to the door, and the only relief she showed was when she found him still there, on the floor by that door hat over his eyes, rifle within reach, the kind of posture that tells a person, "I am not here to own you. I am here to keep watch." The night moved past in coyotes and stove ticks, and the far hiss of wind moving sand like small water, and Jonah did not sleep much, and did not try, because some nights need witness the way a grave needs a stone, so a thing can be counted and remembered. By morning the air had a little edge, the kind that cuts the brightness into squares and sets them down on the ground. Jonah brewed coffee as dark as a coal seam and fried a johnny cake in a spider and stepped out to check the pump. He crouched by the packed earth and read a boot mark, not his, the heel shaved to a small crescent with a nail head showing proud. "That is a print a post trooper wears, or a man who wants to pass for one." He brushed the sign away with his palm. Not because he believed in hiding from fate, but because he believed in buying minutes, and sometimes minutes save lives. He carried the hateful plank to the pit behind the shed and stared a long time at the red letters, "White man never forgive," and he felt the pull to feed the board to fire right then and there. But there is a time to burn and a time to bury, and he laid it under old ash. The knife he kept enclosed and slid deep in a pocket where it could change its use from threat to tool. When he came back inside, Tala was sitting more upright, the blanket drawn up like a shield. Her eyes followed him, and he said, without any ceremony, "There is water, there are beans, there is a roof, and no one crosses it, without my say." She shifted the blanket and touched the bandage on one wrist, and then her mouth formed the words slow and careful, like freight laid on a pack animal. "I will work and not be weight." And he answered, "Work comes when the body asks for it, not before. And you are no weight. You are a person under this roof, and persons are not measured on scales." She ate a little more and then slept again, and in the heat of midday, a dust thread formed on the horizon and moved toward the camp, with the patience of law, or of men who think they are law. The rider wore blue, faded near to gray, and his horse carried itself in the plain, honest way of a government mount. He stopped outside the yard and called hail. Jonah stepped out easy, he said, "I am the man." The visitor tipped his hat and unfolded a paper. He said, "Lieutenant Carver out of the post north and east, scouting a fugitive girl Comanche about 18 eyes, dark hair in braids, suspected in a killing and the theft of a rifle. Rumor puts her near this flat." He held the paper out, and a sketched face looked almost like a person, and not quite like any person that ever lived. Jonah looked, and the wind lifted the edge of the page and tried to take it, and he gave it back and said, "I have not seen her." The officer let his gaze measure the single window, the water barrel, the mare in the pen. He said, if a man were to see her and not say so, he would be standing between his own people and justice. Jonah said, "I stand between my door and the weather lieutenant that keeps me busy." The officer settled his hat again and said, "Dry year coming, watch your stock." He turned and the dust swallowed him, and when he was a mark on the far nothing, Jonah let breath go, and then he went inside where Tala had not moved, but the set of her shoulders told him she had heard every word. He poured water into a second tin cup and set it within reach of the bunk and said, "The post has ears good and bad, so we keep our light low and our steps quiet." She nodded once, not thank you, not trust yet, just I heard, and I am thinking of what it means. The sun softened and the camp wore the kind of quiet that makes a man hear things he usually misses. Jonah sat on the stoop and drew steel across stone, a slow rasp that set time into a cadence, and the sound must have called to whatever inside Tala had started to settle, because the door opened and she stepped out into the long light. It was the first time her feet had touched the yard. She did not run. Her gaze took the measure of sky and fence and corral, and then settled on a square of hard dirt near the post where a wagon often turned. She went there and knelt, and with a little twig, she began to cut lines into the earth. Jonah stayed put until it felt right to move, and then he came and stood, but he kept a respectful number of boot lengths between them. The figure rose from dust under her hand. A bird with wide, strong wings ringed in stylized flame. Not the destroying fire, but the changing fire. The kind old people use in their stories to mean we survive by becoming other and yet remaining ourselves. She was breathing a little hard when she spoke, and her voice had the rasp of someone who has used up more water than she has found. "This is my family sign," she said from before forts and papers, and hard men who pretend law. "It is put on lodge poles and painted on rawhide shields, so children will remember that even burned things can lift." Jonah looked at the bird and at the circle of flame, and he said nothing for a long few breaths, and then he knelt beside the drawing and pressed his palm down into the dirt near the bird, not touching the lines, not smudging the shape, only leaving a print of his hand on the same ground. And that was the whole of what he offered in that second, a witness, not a cure. Tala watched the print grow dull as dust filled it, and then she said more. "There was a woman killed near our hunting ground last winter. The husband told the fort we had done it. The men from town and from ranches and from the flag came with rifles and with the kind of fire that eats everything it touches. They blamed us because it healed their own shame. They tied me when I screamed at them, and they dragged me, and they wrote words on wood so others would see, and they stuck a knife through the letters to say, 'We decide who breathes.'" Jonah felt the old ache in his ribs, where a stampede years past had laid him down and nearly kept him, and he said in a voice that belonged to the ground more than to air, "I do not know what those men called justice, but I know what I saw today. It was not justice." She looked at him then straight and measuring as if she were weighing not his posture or his coat, but the root of his word for a long time. The yard was only wind and the long, soft groan of the pump, and finally she whispered, "I did not steal and I did not kill." He said, "I believe you," with the same plainness. He would say a gate is shut, or a horse is sound, because belief spoken like a fact can sometimes carry more weight than a promise. And at that, the tightness in her throat gave a little, and she bowed her head, and he turned his eyes to the edge of the world, because to stare too close at a person's grief is its own kind of harm. That night the stove threw a gentle orange on the low rafters, and the line camp seemed like a ship sailing a dark sea of dry land. Jonah rolled his blanket near the door as before, and Tala drifted between waking and the kind of sleep that still listens. He told her about the windmill that always complains in the same 3 notes, and about a creek bed that looks empty until the spring storms pull a silver thread through it, and about a Mustang he had once gentled that learned trust, not from grain or rope, but from the silence a man keeps when he means no harm. And while he talked of small things, the room learned their shapes, and decided perhaps to keep them a while. The hateful Plaque lay under ash and waited for a fire that would come when the hour was right and out beyond the mesquite. A long way off, a lone coyote sang to the ghost of water, and then even that fell away, and the night closed the book on its first page of them. Dawn came thin over the llano, and the lamp in the line camp made a small island of warmth against a world that had never promised kindness. Jonah Hale stood in the doorway and watched the wind pull at the hanging strips of rawhide on the corral gate, and he felt the day weigh itself before it started inside. Talanatse slept in fits and starts, and when her eyes opened, there was less of the old fear and more of a new steadiness. She rose and stepped to the basin, and he refreshed the bandages with clean water and a smear of bear grease, and when the stove began its small ticking, she took a spoon of beans and a swallow of coffee thinned with hot water. The ground kept its own counsel until a long thread of dust unrolled from the east and then tightened and stopped at the edge of the yard. 3 riders sat their horses like men who believed the earth owed them a path. The one in front wore a homemade star punched from tin and wired to a strap. His coat was canvas gone gray and his beard was the same. He had the face of a person who liked the taste of saying no. His name was Ephraim Macklin, and beside him rode two that looked like yesterday and tomorrow of the same bad story. Jonah stepped down from the stoop and let his hands hang easy. Ephraim tipped his chin and said, "Hail, we hear talk. You got company, don't belong?" Jonah said he had plenty of company already. Wind dust coyotes. Ephraim smiled without moving the rest of his face and said, "The post put a notice. There is money for that little heathen. You will earn yourself a share if you open your door now." One of the men shifted his rifle, and the horses flicked their ears toward the well. Jonah looked at the pump and at the window where a shadow had moved, and then he said, "Slow. You want to see my room? You can bring a paper with a judge's name on it, or you can bring a war. Neither of you looks dressed for court, and all three of you look too soft for war." Ephraim spat in the dust, and the spittle turned to grit before it hit his boot. He said, "Men who shelter trouble end up part of it." Jonah nodded like a man learning weather and said, "And men who bring trouble find themselves reading the ground for the last time." The pause that followed had teeth in it. Then Ephraim settled back in his saddle and said, "We circle back after sun is gone. Have your thoughts straight by." Then they turned and cantered a short arc, so their tracks ran confusing, and then the dust swallowed them. When the noise fell away, Jonah stood very still and listened to the quiet, and it sounded like a fuse. He went behind the shed and put his hands in the ash pit, and found the board by feel, "White man never forgive." The letters glared dull under gray dust. The knife he had pried from it lay closed inside his pocket, heavy as a choice he called Tala, and she came into the yard with the blanket low on her shoulders. She looked at the plank and at the place where the blade had gone through, and her eyes did not flinch. He said some words. Should not be allowed to live longer than they already have. She reached forward, and without touching the letters, she laid 2 fingers beside the scar in the wood where the knife had bit, as if to take back the space it had stolen. Then she drew away. Jonah stacked cedar splits in the pit and set the board on edge so the fire would eat the words from the bottom up. He kindled with a twist of dry grass and pine pitch and blew from the side, and the flame woke orange, and then clean the paint darkened and blistered and flaked. The letters twisted like snakes trying to get off the wood, and then there was only smoke that smelled of old anger and resin. Tala stood close enough that her shoulder brushed his coat, and the heat drew water to her eyes. But it was not a weeping. It was a kind of washing when nothing but embers glowed. Jonah took the closed knife from his pocket and held it out. She turned it in her palm, felt its balance, and then pressed it back to him and said, "Use it now for rope and bread and never again for words." They stood there while the wind took the last of the smoke and folded it into the sky. Then they stepped inside and packed. Not with haste, but with the terrible neatness of people who know minutes matter. Canvas sacks of biscuits and jerked beef, a poke of coffee and another of salt, a handful of mesquite beans to chew, water bags full to the neck, extra rawhide for tack needle and boar bristle, and a twist of yarrow from her pouch. He tied a second canteen to the horn and wrapped the bedroll tight. She took the beaded necklace in her fist as if feeling for a pulse. He left a small note no one would ever find in the crack under the stovestone, the kind of note that says this place fought hard to remain itself, and when the sun leaned west, they saddled Lucero and the pack horse and waited for the first crease of shadow to make the flats gentler to cross. They moved out under a sky that was all edges, and the land turned the color of hammered pewter. Jonah set a route not straight south, but south and east, along the dogleg of an old cattle trace that cut through a maze of shallow draws and low shelves, the kind of ground that took a print and then lost it. The wind skated grit along the crust and erased their smallest talk. He wrapped strips of old sacking around Lucero's forefeet for a mile at a time to quiet the iron on rock, and then unwound them and tucked them under the saddle strings. Tala rode light and close her eyes, working the land the way a tracker works a page. She would point with a tilt of chin to a line of sage bent a certain way, or to a darker seam of soil that meant damp hours ago. And when night finally laid a black cloth over the plain, they let the horses walk in their own knowledge of where hooves land, Quiet, they were 6 miles out, and the stars made a cold river overhead when Tal's hand lifted and pressed the air, a warning. They slid into the lip of a shallow arroyo and waited a while without speaking. The night spoke instead, coyotes thin and distant, a nighthawk slicing a curve, and once the whisper of grass against something that did not belong there. 3 glints pricked the ridge, and then went dark. Macklin had indeed turned back sooner than he promised. Jonah felt the shape of his rifle by touch, and then let his hand fall, because shooting now would point a finger at everything they meant to save. They stayed until the glints moved away, and then they rose and walked their horses in the arroyo itself, letting the soft sand drink the sound near midnight. The arroyo curled around a stand of saltbush, and then opened like a palm, and that was where the first shot found them. It came from their left and high, and it slashed air close enough to make the horse shy. The second burned a line along Jonah's side. Not deep, but ferocious enough to take his breath. He folded forward and clung to the horn and said, breathless, "Keep riding." And she said no, with a steadiness that allowed no space for argument.
Wash of shadow under an overhang. She tore a strip from the hem of her dress and packed the furrow with yarrow and pressed until the wet slowed. She whispered names under her breath, not to be heard, but to be remembered. Then she took a handful of dry sand and rubbed it around the wound to keep it from shining and smelling, a lesson learned from women who have walked too far with too much loss. She smeared a little ash from an old camp ring along the fabric to kill the white of it, and then she helped him up, and they moved again, not because it was safe, but because stillness had become the more dangerous choice. The gunman above hesitated long enough to argue with the dark, and that was all the luck they would get. They angled out of the arroyo where rock cut low steps into the rim and crossed a bald patch that lit itself with moon. The ford they wanted lay another 10 miles on a snake of water that sometimes kept its promise and sometimes did not. There was a slot in the basalt before it, a place drovers called Stonemouth, because it looked like the ground had decided to swallow the sky and then stopped. Halfway, Jonah pushed that way, because a narrow place can be a door and a barrier. Both the trail. There was a thread on rock, a little white in the moon like bone, and the pack horse stumbled once and almost fell. But Tala caught the lead and spoke to it, low and soft, and the tremble left its knees. Then the night coughed again, and a third burning stitch took Jonah just under the shoulder. This time a mean kiss that gritted his teeth and made light burst at the edges of his sight. She half lifted him by the belt and the collar, and got him into Stonemouth, where the air turned cold and the world went to echo. She pulled both horses in after and looped their reins on a knob of rock, and then she moved back to the throat of the slot and listened. The pursuers reached the open mouth and stopped, because the place had its own voice, the kind that tells a man entering will make him small and break his advantage. Macklin cursed that old dry curse that tries to make fear spit instead of swallow. And then he told his two to wait and watch and smoke and make a plan. He did not ride in because men like him prefer a wide sky where they can wave their hate like a flag. Inside the stone they made a small scrape of tinder between 2 rocks, so the light would not travel. And Tala set the knife Jonah carried to work, not as a threat, but as a needle. She melted a sliver of fat in the tin cup, warmed the bristle in her fingers, and sewed not through the flesh, but through the cloth so the edges would draw, and the wound could weep what it needed to weep. She told him to bite the leather strap, and when his body jolted in the work, she leaned her forehead to his, a moment like a bridge. She chewed mesquite beans to keep her mouth wet, and then shared the handful with him and set his back against the wall so the stone could take some of his weight. She rinsed the cuts with a cap of whiskey from a bottle with no label, a trade from a vaquero months ago for a new latigo. The burn made him shake, and then the shake passed when dawn turned the slot to the color of pale pewter. She stood and went silent to the mouth again and came back with what news rock can tell. She said they are patient, but bored. One sleeps, one rolls a cigarette with the last of his paper, and Macklin has a temper that boils before noon. When the sun eats him, we move. She took strips from the sacking again and wrapped the horses' hooves for the first sprint, and she rubbed ash on the bay noses to dull the shine and pushed strands of dry grass into the hollow prints they had made at the entry
and laid 2 false marks leading toward a blind pocket. She packed the blooded cloths deep in a cleft and closed the gap with a rock so coyotes would not advertise them. And then she sat and rested with her eyes open. Jonah watched her in that half-light and felt the strange weight of gratitude that is not loud and not pretty, but true. It made his chest hurt more than the bullet and less than regret. When the day hit high and the heat took the patience out of men, Stone Mouth turned into a box of shimmering light. Macklin sent one of his boys to ride a loop and look brave, and the other to find higher ground to spit on Jonah, and Tala slipped the knots on the reins and moved their horses like ghosts along the inside of the canyon where the wall cut a thin shelf, maybe 3 hands wide. She kept her palm on Jonah's belt and her shoulder under his when the ground stepped down. Without warning, the horses felt their way, because horses know where they can place what they have, and the little scrape of iron or leather that did happen sounded like wind arguing with stone. The shelf turned into a narrow drain at the far end that opened to a wash hidden under mesquite, and they went out into a world bright as a forge, and nobody there to watch, because hate had turned its head the other way. For a blink they did not run, they did not hurry. They moved with the calm of people who know panic tells more tales than tracks half a mile down the wash. A seep made a small dark smile in the sand, and a scatter of cottonwood saplings marked a promise. Tala dug with both hands, and the ground gave a bowl of brown water that smelled like root and life. She filled the cup and let Jonah drink slow, and the second cup she used to clean the shoulder and press fresh yarrow, and she bound him with a sash from her own waist. The world outside the cottonwoods kept on being vicious, but inside the little ring of green the air cooled enough for breath to remember it was meant for living. She studied the sky and the shadow fall and measured the distance in her head to the ford that lived and died with seasons. She said we go when the first shadow from that big rock points at the small one, and he smiled because even hunted people can have a language that is theirs alone. The horses dozed on their feet and the flies found them and were brushed away by tails made for the work. When the shadow touched the mark, they stepped out again and took the wash to its end, where it joined a wider cut that aimed south and east toward the rumor of water that corrects a desert for a moment, and then forgets it ever did. Behind them on the rim, Macklin found one of the false marks and rode it to the blind and swore himself hoarse and slapped his own horse for knowing more than he did. And then he turned the other way, and the day began to eat him as Tala had said, and his hate grew clumsy, and he did not notice the small feathers of dust lifting from the real trail far below. By evening the light laid down in long bars, and the air let go of its worst, and Jonah breathed deeper. The bleeding had gone from bright to slow, and the cloth held its shape. Tala walked with her hand on the bay whenever the ground pitched, and from time to time she spoke a thin litany. Weend watch our backs stone, remember our steps fire, stay asleep until we ask you to wake. And those words were not spells. They were the old habit of placing a life inside the true things of a country where nothing soft lasts unless it learns to lean on the hard. They came at last to a cut bank where the river shouldered itself through shale and spread into a ford no deeper than a boot top and no wider than a man could miss, and the water made a sound like a quiet promise. They stood there a breath too long because the sight of it took something mean out of both of them. She stepped into the current first, and the cold climbed her legs and told her she had not yet turned to dust. Jonah brought Lucero behind and the pack horse followed, because faith sometimes looks like imitation. They climbed the far bank and the land changed its smell. Mesquite and damp earth, and a thread of green running south like a seam. And for a time the world forgot to hate them, and this was enough to be called grace. They pushed on until the stars came back in their hard, clean way, and the night opened and took them and closed again. And somewhere behind them, on the wrong side of the ford, Ephraim Macklin counted his cartridges and told himself he was owed the end of someone else to make a story hold. But the story had slipped from his hands and was moving under a different sky and inside a narrower kind of light where two people carried it together without saying so. The ford fell quiet behind them, and the river took their tracks like a kind hand, and by the thin light that comes before morning,
Tala Natse found Willow at the bend and cut 2 green wands and split them and wrapped Jonah Hale's shoulder so the pull would not tear what was healing, and he breathed easier, and he thanked her without saying the word, and they walked the horses through the shallows so the water would argue with the truth, and on the high patches of sand she dragged a dead branch to blur the story, and then the country opened to cottonwoods and cane, and a shale bank that held a pocket of shade where the air smelled like metal and mint. And in that ring of green, she made a cook fire no larger than her 2 palms, and softened yarrow in a dented tin, and washed the wound, and spoke the old names for wind and stone, not to conjure, but to remember. And when the sun shouldered up, they moved again along a deer path that stitched the slope like thread, and the dust they had seen on the far rim hesitated where the ground turned to rock, and then wandered the wrong way, and that was all the luck they were going to ask for by midday. A terrace showed itself above floodline stones, set by some hand long gone, and a rough hearth of 3 rocks, and a flat for a pot, and the ghosts of fence posts, leaning like men who had used their strength and were tired of it. And Jonah touched the stones and said, "This was a camp once and could be again." And Tala set her palm on the flat rock, and her breath steadied, as if a rope had gone slack inside her, and they asked the place to hold them, and the place answered with small favors, a coil of vine, a cache of dry sticks, a trickle of water behind roots where the sun had not found it for months, and they did their work like people who had worked together for years, though their days had been counted in a handful of dawns. She repaired tack with bristle and wax. He set a trot line in the slow eddy, and they ate without apology. And when evening drew a copper veil over the river, they sat back to the same tree and listened to water. Say that survival is only the first lesson and living is the second. The next morning, a shape in blue rode out of the cane and stopped at the far edge of the gravel bar, and the horse hung its head the way a government mount does, when it has given more miles than it owns, and the man raised his hat, and did not raise his rifle, and it was Lieutenant Jesse Carver, and his blouse had gone, the color of old slate, and the paper in his pocket had learned the weight of sweat. He said he had followed sign until sign turned into silence, and then he had followed water, because water is where people go who mean to keep breathing. And he said the post had new troubles that ate men faster than old ones, and he said he had no order that could make him shoot mercy, and then he let the river fold their shadows out of his mind and turned away, and the world grew 1 size bigger around them, and Jonah laughed once low and startled by the sound, and Tala rested her hand on his unhurt arm and said, "The country sometimes remembers how to be kind." They did not trust kindness to hold, but they tested it with small weight each day and found that it did. Tala's splints held, and Jonah's fever did not return, and the horses gained, and the cane by the bank learned their names. There was work, and it was honest, and it was slow. They built a low shelter of cane and hide, and set a new hearth that owed nothing to ghosts. She hung a small charm of willow over the doorway, a bird ringed with rising lines, not fire but lifting, and they set tools in places where hands could find them in the dark, and they learned the times. The river speaks loudest after midnight, and the month when the wind smells of rain before it knows rain is coming. And once a month, a vaquero passed and traded flour and a spool of coarse thread for a repair. He had no time to learn, and news that was not dangerous because it was always late. And the land wrote their bodies into itself with scars that no longer burned, and with strength that did not brag. Ephraim Macklin did not stop hating the shape of 2 people who had chosen each other over fear. But hate without a mirror grows bored. And thin, he rode himself into circles and into talk, and then into other business, because men who live on noise must find a crowd to feed it, and the ford shifted, and the old trail closed, and the season turned, and his anger went to seed on a fence post far from the river that never learned his name. There were still hard days in the valley. There were short rations and storms that lay branches down like whips, and nights when the wound in Jonah's side woke and growled, and days when the rope scars in Tala's wrists stung as if they remembered too much. But the work of mending always put a hand over the mouth of the past, and the hand was patient. And that is how mending wins when the first hard stars of winter came sharp enough to cut. She told him a second name her mother had spoken, quiet Nahua,
the echo after rain, and he said, "Then you are Tala the bird and Nahua the echo, and I am the man who carried a knife out of a board and gave it back to bread." And the river kept making a thin, reliable sound like truth spoken by someone who does not love attention. And the sign with its vicious letters was ash now, and ash had gone to soil, and soil had gone to grass, and grass had tipped under the steps of 2 people and 2 horses who were not running anymore but choosing their direction each morning and letting the evening bless it. And now I want to tell you what I have learned watching them. I have learned that a knife can forget cruelty and choose usefulness again. I have learned that a sign can stop speaking, and the silence it leaves is better than the words it held. I have learned that love on a hard land is not a spark, it is a rope, pulled hand over hand until both hands are the rope. I have learned that a river does not promise safety, it promises direction, and if you follow it long enough, it becomes a voice inside you. I have learned that men who believe in ash more than in seed are loud for a season and gone by the next. If this story touched you, if it reminded you that in a land where gunsmoke melts and memory never dies, subscribe to Wild Frontier Tales and turn on the bell so you never miss our trip from a land where gunsmoke fades but memories never do. Every story rides straight into your heart.